The gay doctor who likes his patients. Being a doctor had its perks: power, authority, and access to a lot of men. I wasn't ashamed to admit it. I had a thing for my patients, and I knew exactly how to get what I wanted. Some men were hesitant, unsure, but I could always read them. A lingering stare, a nervous swallow, the way their breathing changed when I stood too close. I never made the first move. I didn't have to. But then, he walked in. A soldier, blonde hair, blue eyes, a body sculpted for war. And for the first time in my life, I knew I was the one in danger. Stay until the end, because this story is forbidden, dangerous, and impossible to resist. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring you more stories that will leave you wanting more. Being a doctor had its privileges. The long hours, the stress, and the emotional exhaustion were all worth it when a particularly interesting patient walked into my office. I liked them young, strong, and preferably the type who had never been touched by another man. The thrill of pushing boundaries was something I never tired of. But then, he arrived. It started like any other consultation. I flipped through the file, barely reading the details. No family history of disease. Recently returned from deployment. Minor injury during a training exercise. Then the door opened. And everything changed. The man who walked in was not just another patient. He was gorgeous. Blonde, with sharp blue eyes that seemed almost unnatural in their intensity. His military haircut was crisp, his jaw strong, his entire presence commanding. But it was his body that made my throat dry. Broad shoulders, a thick chest barely concealed by his gray t-shirt, his biceps stretching the fabric. His waist was lean, defined, and as he moved, I could see the rippling strength beneath his skin. Perfection. I cleared my throat, forcing myself to maintain my usual air of professionalism. Control. I had control. "Lucas Hayes?" I asked, pretending to focus on my notes. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice deep, confident. "Sir." I shifted in my seat, something dangerous igniting in my stomach. This one would be different. I gestured for him to sit on the examination table. "What brings you in today, soldier?" Lucas moved smoothly, settling onto the table, his thighs parting slightly, his presence overwhelming the small space. He had no idea what he was doing to me. "Just a minor shoulder injury," he said, rolling his arm. "I was sparring during training, and I guess I took a bad hit. Nothing serious, but the base doctor said I should get it checked out." I nodded, stepping closer, already feeling the heat radiating from him. "Let's take a look." I reached out, my fingers grazing the curve of his shoulder. Hard muscle, warm skin. I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. "Tell me if anything hurts." Lucas exhaled through his nose as I pressed into the joint, moving my fingers over the firm muscles of his upper arm. I wasn't being inappropriate, not yet. But I was testing him. A flicker of something crossed his eyes, something hesitant, something uncertain. I applied a little more pressure, my touch lingering just a second too long. "Feel any pain here?" His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "No." His voice had changed, softer, almost tight. Oh. I knew that reaction. I had seen it before, that moment when a man who had never considered it suddenly feels it. I let my fingers trail lower, just barely grazing over the edge of his collarbone. "You're in great shape," I murmured, watching his expression carefully. "Your muscles are responding well." Lucas's lips parted slightly, his breath just a little deeper. He wasn't moving away. I knew that look. Curiosity. Conflict. I leaned in just a little, letting my breath brush against his skin. You sure you're not feeling anything? A slow, shaky exhale left his mouth. That was all I needed. I stepped back, breaking the moment, forcing him to sit there dazed, confused, wanting. Your shoulder is fine, I said smoothly, as if nothing had happened. Just some mild strain. You'll be good as new in a few days. Lucas blinked, his hands curling slightly on his thighs, like he wasn't sure what had just happened. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to snap back into the moment. Thanks, Doc. I smirked. He felt it, even if he didn't understand it yet. I reached for the prescription pad, scribbling down some minor recommendations, giving him a moment to collect himself. As I handed him the paper, I let my fingers brush against his again. A test. A challenge. His breath hitched. He was fighting it. I leaned in slightly, my voice low. Take care of yourself, soldier. Lucas stood abruptly, taking the paper from my hand, his movements stiff. Yeah, thanks. Then he turned and left, almost too quickly. I exhaled slowly, watching him go, the scent of his skin still lingering in the room. This wasn't over. He would be back. They always came back. But Lucas Hayes? He was going to break in my hands, and I couldn't wait. Lucas Hayes didn't come back the next day, or the day after that. I expected that. He was fighting it, fighting me. But I had seen the way his body reacted, the way his breath had hitched under my touch, the hesitation in his voice when I got too close. He could pretend it didn't happen, but his body had betrayed him. And I had all the time in the world. It was 5 days later when I saw his name on my appointment list again. My lips curled into a slow smirk as I read it. Lucas Hayes. Follow-up for shoulder strain. Of course, he needed an excuse, a reason to come back, to sit across from me again, to figure out what the hell he was feeling. I loved this part. When they came back, pretending nothing had happened, trying so damn hard to keep it professional, until they couldn't. I played it cool when he walked in. His eyes flicked to me for only a second before he looked away, but that was all I needed. He was tense, standing at attention like he was in the middle of a military drill. I let the silence stretch, let him sit with the weight of his own confusion. Lucas, I said finally, keeping my voice calm, steady. Good to see you again. His throat bobbed. Yeah, just making sure my shoulder's good. I gestured to the table. Take a seat. He hesitated, just for a second, before sitting down. I moved closer than I needed to, close enough to watch the pulse at his throat. Still feeling any pain? I asked. He cleared his throat. Not really. Just... He exhaled sharply as my fingers pressed into his shoulder. Just wanted to be sure. Liar. I knew why he was here. I pressed a little deeper, feeling the heat of his skin. His breath stuttered. I smirked. He was still fighting it. You're fine, I murmured, my voice quieter now, watching the way his fingers curled against the table. Your muscles have recovered well. He swallowed hard. Good. I didn't move away. Neither did he. His breathing had changed. I could feel the tension radiating off him in waves. So I leaned in, just a fraction. Just enough to see his pupils dilate. You sure you don't feel anything? I asked. A heartbeat, a second too long. And then, Lucas snapped. His hand shot up, gripping my wrist, tight, strong, desperate. He looked at me then, really looked at me, his blue eyes dark and unreadable. I waited, daring him. His breathing was ragged, his grip still tight on my wrist, like he was trying to decide whether to push me away or pull me closer. I didn't move. I didn't have to. Because in the next second, Lucas made his choice. And it wasn't to walk away. Lucas didn't let go. His fingers dug into my wrist, firm, controlled, but I could feel the slight tremble underneath. He was still fighting it, still holding on to whatever restraint he had left. But it was slipping. I tilted my head slightly, watching him. "You gonna tell me to stop, soldier?" His jaw clenched. He still hadn't let go. His breathing was uneven, his chest rising and falling too fast. I could practically hear the war waging inside his head, the battle between what he thought he should do and what he wanted to do. He was cracking, and I was going to enjoy watching him break. His lips parted like he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. His grip tightened for just a second before he let go abruptly, like touching me had burned him. He shot up from the table, taking a step back, running a hand over his face. This can't happen," he muttered, more to himself than to me. I leaned back against the counter, watching him with a slow smirk. "Happen?" I echoed. "Nothing happened, Lucas." His nostrils flared slightly. He knew exactly what I was doing. He felt exactly what I felt, but he was still trying to run from it. "I should go," he said, shaking his head. I took a slow step toward him. His shoulders tensed. "You sure about that?" Silence. A thick, loaded silence. I could see his pulse hammering at his throat, his hands clenching at his sides like he needed something to hold on to. Then, finally, he looked at me. And that was it. He moved fast. Fast enough that I barely had time to react before he had me against the wall, his body flush against mine, one hand braced beside my head, the other gripping my waist. His breath was ragged. I don't do this," he ground out, his voice low, almost desperate. I smirked. "You're doing it now." His fingers tightened on my waist. "Shut up." I chuckled, letting my hands slide up his chest, feeling the hard muscle beneath my palms. "Make me." His breath hitched. And then he did. His mouth was on mine before I could even finish my next thought, hard, urgent, hungry. I groaned into the kiss, letting him finally give in to what we both knew was inevitable. His hands moved over me, gripping, pulling, like he couldn't get enough, like he hated how much he wanted this. I tugged at his shirt, pulling him even closer, feeling the heat of his body, the tension in his muscles. This wasn't soft. This wasn't slow. This was raw, unfiltered, years of restraint snapping in an instant. Lucas kissed me like he was at war with himself, and for the first time in my life, I was perfectly fine losing. Lucas kissed like he was trying to erase every doubt, every hesitation that had held him back. His body was all heat and tension, his hands gripping me with a force that made my pulse race. I could feel it, the frustration, the hunger, the way he was fighting and giving in at the same time. I let him lose himself in this. Because once a man like Lucas Hayes crossed this line, there was no turning back. His mouth was urgent, moving over mine with the kind of desperation that came from years of restraint. He had spent his life following orders, doing what was expected, being the perfect soldier. But right now, he wasn't a soldier. He wasn't following any rules. He was just a man who had finally let himself want. I slid my hands up his chest, feeling the hard muscle beneath his shirt, the heat of his skin. His breath hitched as I gripped his waist, pulling him closer. "This what you wanted, soldier?" I murmured against his lips. Lucas froze. For a second, he just stood there, his forehead pressed to mine, his breath hot against my mouth. Then, as if reality had just come crashing down on him, he took a step back. His chest rose and fell too fast. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. I watched as his expression shifted from raw need to something else. Panic. His jaw tightened. "This—" He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "This was a mistake." I exhaled slowly, wiping my thumb over my lips, tasting the aftermath of his loss of control. "You don't believe that?" Lucas let out a sharp breath, turning away. "I shouldn't have come back." There it was, the fear. I stepped forward, but he flinched. That made me stop, because this wasn't just hesitation. This was something deeper, something that wasn't just about me. He ran a shaky hand over his face. "I can't." His voice cracked, and for the first time since meeting him, Lucas Hayes looked defeated. I didn't push. Not this time. Instead, I let him walk away, knowing that he would never be able to forget this. Because now he knew what it felt like to want me. And no matter how hard he tried, he wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. Lucas didn't come back. Not the next day. Not the one after that. I wasn't surprised. Men like him always ran. At least at first. They spent their entire lives controlling everything, locking away every stray thought, every desire that didn't fit into the perfect image they had built for themselves. But there was one thing Lucas didn't understand yet. The body never forgets. No matter how hard he tried to erase that night, no matter how many times he told himself it was a mistake, his body knew the truth. And eventually, he was going to break. I just didn't expect it to happen so soon. It was late, close to midnight, when I heard the knock on my door. I had just finished a long shift, still half-dressed in my scrubs, exhausted but wired from the night. When I opened the door, he was standing there. Lucas. His blonde hair was damp, like he had just showered. He was still in uniform, black military-issued shirt stretched over his chest, cargo pants fitted tight around his thighs. But his eyes, they weren't the same. The hesitation from before was gone. So was the panic. Now, there was something darker, something raw, something that told me he had stopped running. I leaned against the door frame, crossing my arms. "Didn't think I'd see you again." Lucas swallowed. His throat bobbed, his hands flexing at his sides. "I tried to stay away." I smirked. "Didn't work, did it?" He exhaled through his nose, his jaw tight. He stopped himself, inhaling sharply. "I don't know how to make this stop." Ah, there it was. I tilted my head, stepping closer, letting the space between us shrink. "Who says you have to?" Lucas stiffened, his breathing going shallow. I reached out, fingers grazing his wrist, the same way he had touched me that night in my office. Testing. His pulse jumped, and then he grabbed me, one hand fisted in my shirt, pulling me inside, the other slamming the door shut behind him. I barely had time to react before his mouth was on mine. This wasn't like last time. There was no hesitation now, no fear, just need, raw, uncontrolled, desperate. Lucas kissed like a man who had spent every second since our last encounter aching for more. I groaned against his lips, gripping the back of his neck, feeling the tension in his body, the way he shook with the force of what he had been holding back. He pressed me against the wall, his breaths ragged. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, voice rough. I smirked, dragging my fingers down his chest. "I do." And this time, Lucas didn't stop me. Lucas didn't come back. Lucas didn't hesitate this time. His hands were on me, rough, desperate, like he had already lost the battle in his head and was done pretending otherwise. I could feel everything, the tension in his muscles, the heat radiating off his skin, the way his breathing was erratic, like he was starving for something he hadn't let himself have before. He had spent years following orders, controlling himself, pushing things down. But here, in the dim light of my apartment, he wasn't a soldier. He was just a man, giving in to what he had fought against for too long. I let him take control, let him push me back against the wall, his grip firm, almost possessive. "You don't understand what you do to me," he muttered against my lips, his forehead resting against mine. I smirked, my fingers curling around the front of his shirt, pulling him even closer. "I think I do." Lucas let out a shaky breath, his blue eyes dark, unreadable. He looked like he wanted to say something else, but instead, he kissed me again. And this time, there was no restraint. He pressed me back, his body flush against mine, his hands roaming like he needed to memorize every inch of me. His grip was firm, confident, but I could still feel it. That little edge of hesitation, of uncertainty, like he was still figuring out what it meant to want this. I let him. I let him take what he needed, let him feel this without thinking. His breath was hot, his touch searching, like he was trying to convince himself this was real. And then, he slowed. His lips softened against mine, the urgency bleeding into something else, something deeper. For a moment, it wasn't just about need. It was about want. And that was new. Lucas pulled back slightly, his hands still gripping my waist. His breathing was uneven, his pupils blown wide, like he wasn't sure what the hell had just happened. I brushed my thumb over his jaw, smirking. "Still think this is a mistake?" His throat bobbed, but he didn't answer, didn't deny it. Instead, he exhaled sharply and muttered, "I need to go." I arched a brow, but didn't stop him when he stepped back. His hands lingered on my skin for just a second too long before he forced himself to let go. He ran a hand through his hair, his entire body tense, like he was still fighting himself. He swallowed hard, eyes flicking to mine for a second. Then, just as quickly, he turned and headed for the door. I didn't stop him, because I didn't have to. He paused in the doorway, gripping the handle so tightly his knuckles went white. He didn't turn around when he spoke, but his voice was low, rough, wrecked. "I'll be back." And then he was gone. I exhaled slowly, running a hand through my hair, my pulse still racing. Yeah, he'd be back. Because now he knew exactly where he belonged, and no matter how hard he tried, he wasn't going to be able to stay away. Lucas stayed away for a week. I expected him to last longer, but some men, no matter how much they try to fight it, are already lost from the first moment they give in. And Lucas? He had lost the moment he walked into my office. I was finishing a late shift when I saw him. He was waiting outside my building, leaning against his car, arms crossed, tension written all over his body. The streetlights cast shadows over his face, but I didn't need to see his expression to know. He was struggling, still trying to decide if walking away that night was a mistake. I approached him slowly, letting the air between us grow thick, heavy. "You lost?" I teased, smirking. Lucas exhaled, shaking his head. "No." His voice was low, controlled, but I could hear it. The hesitation, the conflict. I leaned against the hood of his car, close enough that he could feel the heat of my body. "You don't have to be here," I murmured. His jaw tensed. "I know." I tilted my head, watching him carefully. "But you came anyway." Silence stretched between us, a war raging behind those blue eyes. Then, finally, Lucas moved. He reached for me, his fingers gripping my waist like he couldn't hold back anymore. I let him pull me closer, let him feel the weight of his own need, let him press me against the car as his breathing turned shallow. "You drive me crazy," he muttered. I smirked, dragging my hands up his chest. "Good." Lucas let out a rough breath, his grip tightening. This time, when he kissed me, there was no hesitation, no regret, just acceptance. And finally, Lucas Hayes stopped running.